8 reasons why Rome fell invasions by barbarian tribes. In 410, the Visigoths successfully sacked the city of Rome. The empire spent the next several decades under constant threat. It was raided by the Vandals. In 476, the Germanic leader Odoacer deposed the Roman emperor. Economic troubles and over-reliance on slave labor. Rome was suffering a severe financial crisis. Constant wars and overspending left the treasury empty. Heavy taxation and inflation impoverished the population. Many wealthy Romans fled to the countryside and set up independent fiefdoms. By the 2nd century, the empire was no longer able to expand its territory. Without a new source of slaves, the empire did not have enough laborers. The rise of the Eastern Empire in the late 3rd century. The two halves of the empire often quarreled over resources and military aid. The largely Greek-speaking Eastern Empire grew in wealth, while the Latin-speaking West descended into economic crisis. The Western political structure finally disintegrated in the 5th century. While the Eastern Empire functioned for another 1,000 years, overexpansion and military overspending. At its height, the Roman Empire stretched from the Atlantic Ocean all the way to the Euphrates River in the Middle East, with such vast territory to govern. The empire faced administrative and logistical challenges. Rome struggled to enlist the required troops and resources to defend its frontiers from local rebellions and outside attacks. Government corruption and political instability, ineffective and inconsistent leadership also weakened the empire. Civil war created chaos, and there were more than 20 emperors over a 75-year span. The changes often occurred due to murder of a reigning emperor, the arrival of the Huns, and the migration of the barbarian tribes. The Huns invaded Europe in the late 4th century, leading to migration of barbarian tribes as the barbarians rampaged through northern Europe. Many Germanic tribes took refuge on the borders of the Roman Empire. The Romans allowed these Visigoths into the safety of Roman territory, but they treated them with extreme cruelty. Germanic tribes like the Vandals and the Saxons began to occupy Britain, Spain, and North Africa. Christianity and the loss of traditional values. Christianity displaced the polytheistic Roman religion, which viewed the emperor as having a divine status. There is a shift in focus from the glory of the state to a single god, weakening of the Roman legions. Unable to recruit enough Roman citizens to serve as soldiers, Roman emperors hired foreign mercenaries to fill out their armies. These Germanic soldiers proved to be fierce warriors, but had little loyalty to the empire. For an empire that collapsed more than 1,500 years ago, ancient Rome maintains a powerful presence. About 1 billion people speak languages derived from Latin. Roman law shapes modern norms, and Roman architecture has been widely imitated. Christianity, which the empire embraced in its sunset years, remains the world's largest religion. Yet all these enduring influences pale against Rome's most important legacy, its fall. Had its empire not unraveled, or had it been replaced by a similarly overpowering successor, the world wouldn't have become modern. This isn't the way that we ordinarily think about an event that has been lamented pretty much ever since it happened. In the late 18th century, in his monumental work, The History of the Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire 1776–1788, the British historian Edward Gibbon called it the greatest, perhaps, and most awful scene in the history of mankind. Tankloads of ink have been expended on explaining it. Back in 1984, the German historian Alexander Demand patiently compiled no fewer than 210 different reasons for Rome's demise that had been put forward over time, and the flood of books and papers shows no sign of abating. Most recently, disease and climate change have been pressed into service. Wouldn't only a calamity of the first order warrant this kind of attention? It's true that Rome's collapse reverberated widely, at least in the Western, mostly European, half of its empire, A shrinking portion of the eastern half, later known as Byzantium, survived for another millennium. Although some regions were harder hit than others, none escaped unscathed. Monumental structures fell into disrepair. Previously thriving cities emptied out. Rome itself turned into a shadow of its former grand self, with shepherds tending their flocks among the ruins. Trade and coin use thinned out, and the art of writing retreated. Population numbers plummeted, but a few benefits were already being felt at the time. Roman power had fostered immense inequality. Its collapse brought down the plutocratic ruling class, releasing the laboring masses from oppressive exploitation. The new Germanic rulers operated with lower overheads and proved less adept at collecting rents and taxes. Forensic archaeology reveals that people grew to be taller, likely thanks to reduced inequality, a better diet, and lower disease loads. Yet these changes didn't last. The real payoff of Rome's demise took much longer to emerge. When Goths, Vandals, Franks, Lombards, and Anglo-Saxons carved up the empire, they broke the imperial order so thoroughly that it never returned. Their 5th century takeover was only the beginning. In a very real sense, Rome's decline continued well after its fall, turning Gibbon's title on its head. When the Germans took charge, they initially relied on Roman institutions of governance to run their new kingdoms, but they did a poor job of maintaining their vital infrastructure. Before long, nobles and warriors made themselves at home on the lands whose old kings had assigned to them. While this relieved rulers of the onerous need to count and tax the peasantry, it also starved them of revenue and made it harder for them to control their supporters. When, in the year 800, the Frankish king Charlemagne decided that he was a new Roman emperor, it was already too late. In the following centuries, royal power declined as aristocrats asserted ever greater autonomy and knights set up their own castles. The Holy Roman Empire, established in Germany and northern Italy in 962, never properly functioned as a unified state. For much of the Middle Ages, power was widely dispersed among different groups. Kings claimed political supremacy, but often found it hard to exercise control beyond their own domains. Nobles and their armed vassals wielded the bulk of military power. The Catholic Church, increasingly centralized under an ascendant papacy, had a lock on the dominant belief system. Bishops and abbots cooperated with secular authorities, but carefully guarded their prerogatives. Economic power was concentrated among feudal lords in autonomous cities dominated by assertive associations of artisans and merchants. The resulting landscape was a patchwork quilt of breathtaking complexity. Not only was Europe divided into numerous states great and small, those states were themselves split into duchies, counties, bishoprics, and cities where nobles, warriors, clergy, and traders vied for influence and resources. Aristocrats made sure to check royal power. The Magna Carta of 1215 is merely the best known of a number of similar compacts drawn up all over Europe. In commercial cities, entrepreneurs formed guilds that governed their conduct. In some cases, urban residents took matters into their own hands, establishing independent communes managed by elected officials. In others, cities ran charters from their overlords to confirm their rights and privileges. So did universities, which were organized as self-governing corporations of scholars. Councils of royal advisors matured into early parliaments, bringing together nobles and senior clergymen as well as representatives of cities and entire regions. These bodies came to hold the purse strings, compelling kings to negotiate over tax levies. So many different power structures intersected and overlapped, and fragmentation was so pervasive that no one side could ever claim the upper hand. Locked into unceasing competition, all these groups had to bargain and compromise to get anything done. Power became constitutionalized, openly negotiable, and formally portable. bargaining took place out in the open and followed established rules. However much kings liked to claim divine favor, their hands were often tied, and if they pushed too hard, neighboring countries were ready to support disgruntled defectors. This deeply entrenched pluralism turned out to be crucial once states became more centralized, which happened when population growth and economic growth triggered wars that strengthened kings. Yet different countries followed different trajectories. Some rulers managed to tighten the reins, leading toward the absolutism of the French Sun King Louis Roman XIV. In other cases, the nobility called the shots. Sometimes parliaments held their own against ambitious sovereigns, and sometimes there were no kings at all and republics prevailed. The details hardly matter. What does is that all of this unfolded side by side. The educated knew that there was no single immutable order, and they were able to weigh the upsides and drawbacks of different ways of organizing society. This wasn't the only way in which Western Europe proved uniquely exceptional. It was there that modernity took off. The Enlightenment, the Industrial Revolution, modern science and technology, and representative democracy, coupled with colonialism, stark racism, and unprecedented environmental degradation. Was that a coincidence? Historians, economists, and political scientists have long argued about the causes of these transformative developments, even as some theories have fallen by the wayside. From God's will to white supremacy, there's no shortage of competing explanations. The debate has turned into a minefield, as scholars who seek to understand why this particular bundle of changes appeared only in one part of the world wrestle with the heavy baggage of stereotypes and prejudices that threaten to cloud our judgment. But as it turns out, there's a shortcut. Almost without fail, all these different arguments have one thing in common. They're deeply rooted in the fact that, after Rome fell, Europe was intensely fragmented, both between and within different countries. Pluralism is the common denominator. If you side with those scholars who believe that political and economic institutions were the basis for modernizing development, Western Europe is the place for you. In an environment where bargaining trumped despotism and exit options were plentiful, rulers had more to gain from protecting entrepreneurs and capitalists than from fleecing them. Size also mattered. Only in moderately sized countries could commercial interests hope to hold their own against aristocratic landlords. Smaller polities enjoyed greater capacity for inclusion, not least by means of parliamentary deliberations. The better medieval legacies of pluralism survived. The more such states developed in close engagement with organized representatives of civil society, international competition rewarded cohesion, mobilization, and innovation. The more governments expected from their citizens, the more they had to offer in return. State power, civic rights, and economic progress advanced together. But what if Europeans owed their later preeminence to the ruthless oppression and exploitation of colonial territories and plantation slavery? Those terrors too grew out of fragmentation. Competition drove colonization while commercial capital greased the wheels. Geography as such played second fiddle. It has been said that the Europeans rather than the Chinese reached the Americas first simply because the Pacific is much wider than the Atlantic. Yet successive Chinese empires failed to seize even nearby Taiwan until the Ming finally intervened in the late 17th century and never showed much of an interest in the Philippines, let alone more distant Pacific islands. That made perfect sense. For an imperial court in charge of countless millions of people, such destinations held little appeal. Large empires were generally indifferent to overseas exploration, and for the same reason it was small, geographically peripheral cultures, from the ancient Phoenicians and Greeks to the Norse, Polynesians, and Portuguese, that had the most to gain from striking out. And so they did. Had Europeans not sailed forth with reckless abandon, there would have been no colonies, no Bolivian silver, no slave trade, No plantations, no abundant cotton for the Lancashire mills. Capitalizing on military skills honed by endless war, European powers escaped the perpetual stalemate on their own continent by exporting violence and conquest across the globe, separated by entire oceans from the imperial heartlands. Colonized populations could be squeezed much harder than would have been feasible back in Europe over time. Much of the world turned into a subordinate periphery that fueled European capitalism.